Okay, so thank you all for joining us today. This is the last bill on our busy summer docket, so I appreciate all of the council members' time as we work through these important bills. So just really quickly, it's been about 3 weeks since we last met, so just to quickly approve the minutes that were sent out, feels like an eon ago, but the last meeting, all we did was vote on the report for House Bill 412, and the recommendation was that we urge the, you're not talking, I'm going to mute everybody. Okay, so the recommendation was to urge the association to work with the legislator to address the specific supervision aspects of technicians. So just briefly, if I can just get a motion in a second to approve those minutes, we can move on. I muted everyone, so you'll have to unmute yourself to do this, council members.
Hey, oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Anna, this is Stephen DeBon. I'll make the motion.
Perfect.
And Sam Tiefley, I'll second.
Great. Okay, well, just really quickly, just say, everyone say aye, and we'll move on.
Aye.
Awesome. Okay. Okay, so so our last bill is House Bill 476, and normally I have Matthew from my office do a little summary and statewide comparison, but I am going to do that today. So briefly, this is a bill that is not to license a new profession. They've been licensed for a very long time in the state. What this bill does is, and I sent this all out to you all, so I won't read the whole thing, but basically it is moving the Pels board from under the Secretary of State's purview to be administratively attached to the Secretary of State's office. So that's as quick of a summary as you can kind of get for it, but that's what it does. So I sent all this stuff out to everyone beforehand, and it is in an email if you want to kind of peruse it, but I do want to be cognizant of everybody's time. We did a review of the other states and how their boards are relative to whether they are under a different office, another office, or are they quasi freestanding. And so that was sent out to you all as well. And what we found was that there are 20 of the states that currently have freestanding boards where they're not attached to their version of a Secretary of State or a licensure division. So those state, that Excel file has been sent out to you guys. I will read the states that are freestanding. So it's Alabama, Arizona, Arkansas, Kansas, Louisiana, Minnesota, Mississippi, Nebraska, Nevada, New Mexico, North Carolina, North Dakota, Ohio, Oklahoma, Oregon, Texas, Washington, West Virginia, and Wyoming. I didn't do a map out regionality of this. It does seem like a lot of the southern states are separate, but that's just from reading them. So that's everything else has been emailed out to you guys. There were several letters of recommendation. I just want to bring note to you, letters of support, not recommendation, were sent out in your packet. So if y'all had time to peruse those. I do believe that we have a few folks on the call, either this call or the next call, who are going to speak to the same thing. But I want to go ahead and turn it over to Representative Washburn just to speak on this briefly, because it is his bill, and then we'll get going with Sully and Ashley. I don't know which one of you is going to handle it, but for now, let's Representative Washburn.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here today to speak in support of House Bill 476, obviously. I'll keep it very brief. We think it is very good legislation. Certainly benefits the engineers and surveyors by giving them better governance and with better general supervision. It's also good for the consumers, of course, because if it improves the service of the engineers and surveyors, it certainly benefits the consumers of Georgia. Lastly, we don't think it hurts the state at all. In fact, it does not hurt the state at all financially. The same revenue that is going into the general fund now will continue to. And so I urge your support of this legislation. I think it's very good. Follows the pattern of the real estate practitioners, accountants, lawyers, and and many other groups. And so we think it is very good legislation. I'd be glad to entertain any questions if anybody has any.
Thank you, sir. Council, any questions for the representative on the bill? Okay, not hearing any. Sully, I will quit sharing my screen and you can go ahead. Thank you, Representative.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I don't have any slides to share.
Okay.
I want to try to be respectful of everybody's time, but I do want to be thorough. My name is Michael Sullivan. I'm the president and CEO of ACC Georgia, which is the trade association for Georgia's engineering industry. As the chairman indicated, the legislation just deals with the existing state board of registration for professional engineers and land surveyors, or PELS board, as we like to call it, which has been in existence since 1937. So it's probably one of Georgia's oldest licensing boards. And all this bill proposes is making the PELS board a separate budget unit and agency that would be administratively attached to the Secretary of State's office. But we want to be clear, what it proposes is nothing new in Georgia. It's absolutely nothing new in Georgia. In fact, several other professions already have licensure boards that are outside of the Secretary of State's office. As Representative Washburn indicated, the accountants, attorneys, dentists, doctors, insurance agents, pesticide applicators, pharmacists, and realtors are outside the Secretary of State's office. In fact, the structure proposed in this bill is the exact same arrangement that the Georgia Real Estate Commission has, which has been a separate budget unit administratively attached to the Secretary of State's office for more than 4 decades. And the language of our bill is taken almost entirely verbatim from the Public Accountancy Act of 2014. That was a bill that was passed by the General Assembly and signed into law in 2014, and which GORC recommended for approval. So not only is what our bill proposes nothing new, its language was taken directly from a bill that was previously recommended for approval by GORC. And as the chairman indicated, just as this proposal is nothing new in Georgia, it's also nothing new across the country. We didn't survey the entire country. We tried to focus on the southern states, and specifically Alabama, Florida, Kentucky, Louisiana, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Texas. All of these states have their own dedicated staffs, and all are funded solely by their licensure fees and not by taxpayer funds. All but 2 of those states, Tennessee and South Carolina, also have a PELS board that is a completely independent state agency. They hire their own staff, their own executive director, their own investigators, attorneys, and they have their own offices. The fact is, this is the way that many other states across the country handle their engineer and land surveyor licensure boards. Georgia's professional engineers and land surveyors, in fact, are the only ones in all of the southern states we surveyed who don't have their own dedicated professional licensing staff. And we think Georgia's engineers and land surveyors deserve better than that. And so does the public, whose safety these engineers and their licenses protect. I don't want to belabor the licensure problems that engineers and surveyors have experienced over many years. We could have dozens of people testify about that. But let me just say that these problems are one of the most frequent complaints that I hear about from my members. And they really run the gamut. Everything from the simple, I can't get anybody to return my phone call or give me information or tell me whether they received my application or whether I can sit for an exam or whether I passed an exam that I already sat for, to very serious violations of health, safety, and welfare protections of Georgia citizens. And these are serious concerns. In fact, this lack of enforcement has gotten to the point within our industry that it's created a perception, widely held perception, I believe, within our industry that there's not even any point in filing a complaint because they assume that nothing will be done. So you've got some complaints that are out there that are getting filed that have languished for years. And this represents a real threat to public safety, which is the underpinning of all professional licensure. To provide a little statistical context, Florida has an independent PELS board. It's actually a public corporation. They have dedicated investigators for their 45,000 licensed engineers. And in 2020, Florida processed 451 complaints regarding engineering practice, of which 372 were found to be legally sufficient. Alabama, with 7,000 fewer engineers than Georgia, processed close to 100 cases in 2020. By contrast, there was only 1 case brought before the PELS board in 2020. And again, as I mentioned earlier, there are numerous other cases that have been languishing without any progress or resolution for years. And this lack of investigations puts the public at risk from the actions of bad actors. The PELS board is currently staffed by an executive director and 3 support staff members. These 4 individuals also oversee 6 boards. 2 years ago, they only supported 5 boards. But these 4 people serving 6 boards means there is the equivalent of less than 1 full-time person for each of these 6 licensure boards. Now, we understand there may be a place for the efficiencies of scale that could potentially be offered by combining many different licensure boards under a shared staff, but we would respectfully submit that what might be okay for occupational licensure is not appropriate for licensed professionals whose work serves to protect the public from potentially catastrophic consequences. That difference between occupations and professions may be why, or a big part of why, all those other professions that I mentioned earlier are already outside of the Secretary of State's office. To use a euphemism, when a barber makes a mistake, the mistake will usually grow back. Bridges and buildings that fail don't grow back. I also want to make it clear that while these kinds of problems have existed for a long time, we have also been working within the system for a long time to try to improve things without leaving the Professional Licensing Board division. In 2005, the Pels Board itself undertook a self-study and made several recommendations for improvement. In 2013, we were involved in the House Study Committee on Professional Licensing Boards, which was chaired by Representative Ed Reinders and included Chairman Terry England as a member. And in 2018, we participated in the House Study Committee on Professional Licensing Boards Operations and Funding that was chaired by Representative Brett Harrell. For more than a decade, in fact, we've been trying to find a way to make the Professional Licensing Board division work better for engineers, land surveyors, and in fact, the other 40 licensed professions under its jurisdiction. HB 476 was not our first reaction to this problem. It is the result of years of trying to make the current system work better and seeing it work worse instead. Now, historically, y'all are probably aware the Secretary of State's office has believed that a removal of a licensure board from its jurisdiction might result in some corresponding reduction in their budget appropriation. While we reject this idea that moving the Pels Board means that some sort of budget reduction is inevitable or unavoidable, our proposal goes to great lengths to address this concern. I'd like to get into that. And I do want to be clear, the arrangement it's based on, like everything else about our proposal, is also nothing new. For decades, the Georgia Real Estate Commission has routinely received an annual appropriation of approximately 85% of the total amount of fee revenue that they generate. And the Georgia Real Estate Commission is required by law to provide a written annual report of that revenue to the governor and the chairs of the House and Senate Appropriations Committee. And we have included an identical requirement in lines 134 through 141 on page 6 of our bill. In all of our discussions with the governor's office and the chairman of the House and Senate Appropriations Committee, we've made it clear that rather than requesting an annual appropriation of approximately 85% of the fees that will be generated by the Pels Board, the percentage that's annually requested by the Real Estate Commission, the Pels Board will be requesting only 75% of the fee revenue that it will generate. And we didn't just pick that percentage out of thin air. Engineers and land surveyors currently contribute more than $620,000 per year to the general fund based on the current renewal fee structure of $25 per year for engineers and land surveyors and $5 a year for engineering or land surveying firms. Based on our total number of licensees, our proposed annual budget can be fully funded by an increase of just $100 to the current annual fees paid by engineers and surveyors. This new cumulative $125 fee would generate $3,132,625 per year from license renewals alone, of which Pels would only be requesting an annual appropriation of $2.5 million. That would leave more than $630,000 in the general fund that would continue to be used to fund the operations of the Professional Licensing Board division. In fact, there would be more than that because I didn't include a bunch of other assorted fees that are also charged, such as applications for comedy license, intern licenses, license verification fees, and reinstatements, which would actually add to that total. None of that revenue would be part of the $2.5 million annual appropriation request. So there would be no reduction to current general fund revenue and therefore no corresponding need to reduce the budget of the Professional Licensing Board division. In fact, it could be argued that House Bill 476 actually improves things for the Secretary of State's office, because if they receive the same annual appropriation, since there's no reduction in general fund revenue, and would no longer be responsible for administering the Pels Board and its 25,000 licensees, easing the workload for the Professional Licensing Board division staff slightly. And as for the proposed budget amount itself, we reviewed the budget and staffing levels and number of licensees for engineer and land surveyor boards across the South. Annual budgets ranged anywhere from a low of $1.2 million per year in South Carolina to $4.5 million in Texas, where I guess everything is bigger. While there were a lot of commonalities across these states, we determined that North Carolina was the most similar to Georgia in terms of number of licensees, state population, and overall economic activity. And of course, that also correlates to engineering and land surveying activity. We looked at North Carolina's budget and staffing, which is $2.9 million per year with a staff of 15. We believe we can do it with fewer staff and a lower budget of $2.5 million. And as mentioned earlier, the total amount of $2.5 million can be generated by a $100 increase in current individual licensure fees. And it's worth noting that even with that proposed $125 per year licensure fee, our renewal fees would still put Georgia's fees among the lowest in the South. And that's an important consideration for us because a high percentage of engineers are licensed in multiple states, often dozens of states. I know one engineer that's licensed in 32 states. As a result, they are very familiar with what other states charge, and we wanted to make sure that Georgia remained among the lowest. Of course, because so many engineers are licensed in multiple states, it also exacerbates the problem engineers are facing in Georgia and that they're struggling with because they know how engineer licensure can be done right. They've experienced it firsthand, they know it's possible, and they want it to be that way in Georgia too. The good news is we don't have to reinvent the wheel to get there. We can follow the models that are well established by the engineer and land surveyor boards in our sister states, and also the legal, structural, and budgetary models of professional licensing boards that are right here in Georgia. It's a system that's worked well for the Georgia realtors for more than 40 years, and more recently for Georgia's accountants, dentists, pharmacists, and several other licensed professions in Georgia. In addition to ACC Georgia, this proposal is also supported by the Surveying and Mapping Society of Georgia, which represents Georgia surveyors, the Georgia Society of Professional Engineers, and the Pels Board itself. We would all respectfully ask you to allow Georgia's engineers and land surveyors to follow the model established by these other Georgia professions and to follow GORC's previous recommendation of approval for the Public Accountancy Act of 2014 by also recommending approval of House Bill 476. I'd be happy to answer any question that you might have.
Thank you, Sully. Members, are there any questions that you have? You're all muted if anybody's trying to speak. Okay, I have a question. So I understand what you're saying about the funds and how it will cover it, but how are you going to pay for the startup costs because you won't have licenses at that point? And by the way that the appropriations would kind of work is you would kind of have to appropriate them to start up, obviously, and then hope that you collected it towards the end. So how are you guys planning to, how are you going to handle the startup funds? And
Well, one of the
be?
things, yeah. So one of the things that we did is one of the first things we had to do is we had to change the biennial renewal, which is standard for most licensure boards. Since it's an annual appropriations process and an annual funding process, we needed that renewal to be annual so that would coincide, and that the executive director would be able to meet that annual requirement for a report of revenues that were received. The intent would be, should the bill pass the General Assembly, that they would go ahead and put that requirement in place, that the renewal would be done in the fiscal year that the appropriations would occur, and so that the revenue generation would be during the same fiscal year that the appropriation would be for. As far as the startup costs, we certainly have had some conversations about that. I mean, it would be true with any state agency that were created from scratch, brand new. You're making an appropriation before if it generated revenue before the revenue was generated. But you could do that as part of the supplemental budget in the current fiscal year, assuming the General Assembly wanted to do that, so that some of the implementation software, office space, desks, pencils and pens, and all the things that they would need to operate would be able to be acquired and put in place prior to the operation. Also, I think you could envision, and I'm sure this was the case with the accountants and the dentists and the pharmacists, which were the three most recent professions to move from the Secretary of State's office to either other state agencies, or in the case of the accountants, or in the case of no, the accountants are not. They're in the state accounting office. You could have some sort of an interim phase where, similar to the way enterprise agencies work, where some funds were paid from the board to, continue operating for some period of time.
Okay. Anybody else have follow-up questions?
Certainly, one of the things we're going to have to change is the effective date of the legislation, which is
Sure.
2020.
Sure. I'm just, yeah. So the accountants were the most recent, and that was in 2014. So yes, Gort did this, but it was definitely predated my time here. When were the real estates moved out, and everyone else? Do you have those dates? Like how recently was all of the moves?
So the real estate was, as far as we can tell, and of course, sometimes it's hard to track through the code of, when certain things were put in place. But there was a lawsuit filed by the Real Estate Commission. We think they were the first commission to move. The State Bar of Georgia, for example, was never part of a state agency. It was created in 1964 as a standalone entity with enforcement to the Secretary or the Supreme Court. But the realtors were within the Secretary of State's office. They sued under the code provision that requires fees charged to roughly approximate the cost of the service delivered. They were alleging in that 1977 lawsuit that that was not the case, that they were not receiving the same amount of service that they were paying for, and they were requiring that the fee be reduced. And as a settlement of that lawsuit, so they got a successful result. I think it was filed in Fulton County Superior Court in 1977. They got a successful result, and then as a settlement of that lawsuit, it's my understanding that the General Assembly at that point created the Georgia Real Estate Commission as a separate budget unit and administratively attached to the Secretary of State's office. Of course, I was in elementary school in 1977, so I don't have any.
So around like 1977. Okay, somebody just said 1972. Okay.
Yeah. So it's been we would submit a very well-established process in Georgia, or practice in Georgia, to have a board separate from the Professional Licensing Board division, administratively attached and as a separate budget unit, fully funded by its licensure fees.
Sure. So part of I would like you to provide, if not probably before the next meeting, your breakout of how you came up with those costs. I'm just genuinely curious. Because yes, the hiring is, sometimes it's hard to hire, sometimes it's hard to keep hiring based on the I guess the pay bands around salaries and positions. So are you concerned were this to happen, are you going to actually be able to get staff?
I think there is an element of speculation to it, right? Until the board has been authorized to exercise the power to hire and to engage and to release office space and all of those things, you don't have hard numbers. We could assume, for example, that the office space would be $25 per square foot, but until you've actually picked an office and determined the actual cost, you don't really know. So certainly the theory behind the numbers that we've put in place is a belief that that's the ceiling, and that the operations won't exceed that amount. And of course, they definitely won't exceed the appropriated amount, because that's how state agencies work. They have to operate within their budget. And so the fee increase would comport with whatever the appropriation amount was. One concern that we certainly do have is that the pay rate of investigators will be significantly higher than what's currently being paid, because frankly, one of the challenges that's currently faced is because investigators have to be post-certified, they're police officer trained, and the salaries are so low that are currently paid for investigators within the Professional Licensing Board division, that essentially you can get post-certified and go almost to any police department in Georgia and make more money pretty quickly. And so there's a high rate of turnover, which we certainly don't want to have with our investigators. We'd also like our investigators to potentially be retired or semi-retired land surveyors and or engineers who have firsthand knowledge of the practice that they're investigating, so that they would be a little bit more qualified to investigate those things than what we currently have.
Mhm. So, but
Go ahead.
you obviously had a, like, something in, I'm just curious to see your calculation or how you came up with it.
It really was just thinking, using North Carolina as our sort of rule of thumb, assuming that pay rates and things are sort of similar in North Carolina. I'm sure you have much higher salaries in Charlotte, for example, than you do in other parts. Research Triangle probably higher. Similar economies, similar populations, hopefully somewhat similar salary bands.
Sure. No, I'm just curious because the fiscal impact is obviously, and it's the code reads the fiscal impact to Georgians. So they're, these people are Georgians. So I am curious to how your calculations for how, as we write the report, because, and I did check, there was not a fiscal note done on House Bill 476. We did not do one. It may have been a different iteration of this bill previously. So there is no fiscal note to pull from this for our offline conversation yesterday. So I'm just curious, but we do need to write on this. So
yeah, we would be curious to look at how the process worked in 2014 and how they sort of backed into some of those numbers where you've got, a thing that's going to occur, but you haven't hired the people, you haven't actually.
I would also love to do that, but what I have on record is the report. So
awesome.
The accounting may be able to help you. Maybe somebody there.
We'll be happy to actually reach out. We know the sponsor of the bill of the Accounting Act and who is also an accountant, and so we can reach out to them and see if maybe they have some documentation. We'd be happy to share that.
Yeah, I'm just curious. So because I come from the budgeting world, so I'm piqued my interest.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I've seen Mark popping up on a couple of comments. So let me just finish. Any other council members have questions before we move on? Okay. Mark, were you wanting to speak, or Ashley, who were the individuals? I don't actually have them written in front of me.
Yeah, so we have online Russ Pennington, who's a member of the Pels board, and Darian Sykes are definitely on. I did see Mark Chastain pop on as well. And Anna, I just forwarded you the fiscal note that I was sent May 5th regarding the bill. So I just forwarded that to your email. But I know Russ is on I-16. Russ, are you still able to be connected? Maybe Russ fell off. Well,
Russ is currently driving on Interstate 16, so his cell service may be spotty.
I'm here. It just took a minute to unmute. If you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you. Thanks, Russ.
Sure. So clearly I would speak on behalf of the bill. Guys, I guess I went on the board in 2014 and just got reappointed. So, in that history, we've seen, just from a compliance perspective, I think that's where I want to focus in terms of where I feel the importance. When you look at the amount of engineering and construction work in our industry today, and then you look at an influx of funds into the state of Georgia, particularly through the process the governor's office is doing right now with the ARP funds and the construction and engineering that will result from that, we are at an all-time high, and I think engineers are maxed to a point of nobody's ever seen this amount of work in the profession. Same trickles to land surveyors, same trickles to structural engineering. It's the entire regulated entity that our board regulates. And so having a profession that in essence is going unregulated without having inspectors employed that have the knowledge, without being able to pursue complaints, it's a serious concern to me as a professional. But I think it's a serious concern to the state and what their interests are. And when I was appointed to the board in 2014, I actually was an employee of EPD, and we changed our regulated procedures for certain type of landfill. And literally, I took 13 cases of what we perceived as falsification of licensure to the board from EPD's changes. Of those 13 licenses, none saw any action. And that's not necessarily, I'm not throwing stones at Secretary of State staff or anything else. I think that's just the nature of the beast of a professional regulation being stuck in with shared staff and shared resources. It's Secretary of State's office. It's also the Attorney General's office in terms of those shared resources and the procedures. And when we look at the other boards with the other states, and we interact with each of those boards through NCES, which is National Council of Examiners for Engineers and Surveyors. So we're working with our peers in those other states, and we see those resources. And we've just got that carrot hung out there in terms of it could be so much better without having any additional cost to the state. So I'll leave it at that, but I really think it's something the state should consider in terms of its own well-being with all the work that we have. It's a fortunate place for us to be, but thank you for your time and consideration.
Thank you.
And I know Darren Sykes is also on the line. He's also on the Pels board. Darren, did you want to add anything to what Russ said?
Sure. I just want to echo what Russ said. My name is Darian Sykes. I serve as the vice chair for the Pels board. Also began serving in 2014 and was reappointed. And I know that most of the people that are on here serve the community, and that is my goal, to serve at the highest level. In addition to the regulations, in reviewing applications, there was an individual who was trying to move to Georgia, and his ability to move was based on getting his application processed. And there was this is getting a job, and he had a family, and this was a very long, drawn out process that was challenging for him. Their real lives that are affected behind this. And I know that everybody here that is serving wants to serve at the best level. And that's the goal of this, is that we want to serve the public. We want to serve the community at the highest level. And I believe that this will allow us to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And the only other person I'd asked to attend is Taylor Wright. And I know he was having to call in. I don't know if he was able to do that. Taylor, are you on the call? He may not have made it on.
I don't see any other phone dials in other than the gentleman who just spoke.
Okay.
So council members, any questions for Darian or anyone else so far? Okay. So I always leave time for people who didn't sign up to talk, but just general public comment. So I will let Mark, if you wanted to speak, please go ahead.
Thank you, ma'am. I'll be very brief. I don't have any desire to repeat everything. Mr. Sullivan spoke very detailed and very well on the subject. I'm a recovering Pels board member. I served for 18 years from 2003 till July of this year. Kathy Cox was the Secretary of State when I was appointed, as a matter of fact. I don't want to repeat or rehash everything, but I would maybe put just a more of a down-to-earth flavor to it. Sometimes in the past, this effort has been going on since before I was appointed. Before I was appointed, I was on the SAMSOG Legislative Committee and worked on the Monumental House Bill 285, I believe it was back then. And that's how I kind of got involved with a lot of this. And there was an effort to enhance the funding and the function of the board even before that time. As Sully said, this is not new. But to kind of put it in perspective, especially when the legislators take it to heart, because they're not all, at least, engineers or practitioners. This is not a bill to try to make the Pels board a luxury club or some sort of country club, or by any means. It's true that the 18 years that I served and continuing on, the Pels board members donate a tremendous amount of billable time. into doing now, it's gotten worse. We had better staffing concentration when I was appointed, and we got executive summaries and staff recommendations. The last 10 or 15 years, we became clerical workers also. About half the time that we put in was simply reviewing applications to see if they had 5 references, to see if they had a transcript, things that should have been delegated to a staffing level, frankly. What this really means to the public is, so this is not a bill just to help Pels board members or to aggrandize either profession, in my opinion, but it's something that the public desperately needs. I've been a cognizant member those 18 years and was involved in virtually every disciplinary case. And whether it's land surveyors that create title messes, that hold up closings, that devalue property, that put property in litigation and put it basically froze where families can't sell their property. I saw this dozens, if not 100 times, simply by unregulated substandard professionals that have no fear of being sanctioned. The general public is basically put in a position of having to take this at their expense to the civil court system for remedy. And that's a very expensive proposition that's, many years. That's, in my opinion, the general public should not be at risk of that when we're under a higher level of scrutiny and provide enough funding to be budget positive. But more so even with engineers, it took us years to get, and I don't even know if it's concluded yet, I think it is, but to get an individual to cease and desist providing traffic studies and designing intersections in the metropolitan area without a PE license. And there's been cases of out-of-state engineers that were basically fabrication and manufacturing engineers sealing structural drawings for bridges and for structural components of industry and heavy construction that wound up causing serious problems and damaging some public entities that were funding the projects as well as private. So the bigger picture is the public as a whole is hugely benefited by this in ways that most people won't see every day, but it's very worthwhile, and I would support it and would be happy to answer any questions or speak to any groups if it would be beneficial. That concludes my comments unless someone has any questions.
Thank you. Council members, any questions? Okay, well, so how I foresee this going forward, thank you, Mark. How I foresee this going forward, so we have did someone just try to speak? Was that me? Okay. Our next meeting is, I believe, October the 6th. And I would like to see the calculations for how the proposed board would potentially be funded and all of that, because it is one of the things that we look at. But I believe Secretary of State may pop in. I talked to Gabe before this. He couldn't make this meeting. He may show up to the next one, but I would expect us to have a draft report to discuss at the next meeting. But that's how I foresee things moving forward, unless there's any questions from members at this time. Okay. So this may be one of the fastest new first meetings we've had. So I appreciate the brevity of the association. So please reach out to me if you have any questions, members or association folks. I'm happy to answer anything. And then if there's nothing else, I'll have minutes posted maybe by Friday, and then certainly a video we can have up tomorrow if there's anybody who missed the meeting and wanted to join in. So yeah. Ashley, I just saw you unmute yourself.
I was just going to say thank you. We appreciate you guys taking the time to listen to our presentation.
All right. Well, thank you guys. Again, let me know if there's any questions that you guys have for me on my end. All right. Thank you, everyone.